Michael Anderson walked into his home, weary from a long day of mediating disputes between feuding parties. His job as a mediator for a renowned conflict resolution firm in New York City was demanding, often leaving him drained. Today had been particularly rough, with two parties more focused on inflicting pain than finding common ground. The world of mediation was his second calling after an unexpected career shift during college. Growing up in a bustling household with 5 siblings in Boston, Mike had always been the peacemaker. After their father passed away, their mother struggled to keep the family together, making Mike's natural inclination for resolving conflicts invaluable. It wasn't a career he had planned. Originally, he had dreams of being a writer. But life, as it often does, took unexpected turns. A chance involvement in a labor dispute at the factory he worked at led him to the world of mediation. This detour saw him switch his major to business with a minor in psychology, eventually leading to a full-time position at the arbitration firm. Mike's thoughts wandered as he walked through the front door of their Brooklyn apartment. He was greeted by the familiar sights and sounds of home, yet something felt off. Christine, or Chris as she preferred, was usually bustling around, creating a warm and welcoming environment. Today, there was an unusual silence. Chris was a curator at a cutting-edge technology museum in Manhattan. Her passion for gadgets was the perfect counterbalance to Mike's love for classical music and opera. Their marriage of nearly 12 years had been a blend of these diverse interests, adventures, and shared passions. They met at a co-ed soccer game shortly after Mike moved to New York. Chris, with her captivating eyes and infectious smile, had approached him with a witty remark that led to a conversation, an impromptu movie date, and eventually a whirlwind romance that culminated in their marriage. Despite their deep love, life hadn't been without its challenges. Chris had undergone multiple surgeries due to severe endometriosis, which had led to the removal of parts of her reproductive system. This had been a painful reality for both of them, particularly for Mike, who had always envisioned having children. Yet, choosing Chris over the dream of parenthood had been an easy decision for him. They had instead focused on living life to the fullest, embarking on adventures across the globe, from running with the bulls in Spain to bungee jumping off the Sydney Harbor Bridge. Their social circle had shifted over the years, especially as friends started families. They found themselves drifting apart from those with children, leading to a more insular yet fulfilling life together. They would often joke about their child-free status, masking a shared sense of loss with humor and intimate moments. Mike's work frequently took him out of town for short trips, resolving disputes for various clients. Chris also traveled for her museum job, especially to tech companies donating historical equipment. These trips, though sometimes mundane, had their perks, like the time Mike got to golf in Arizona during winter or gamble on nickel slots in Las Vegas. Mike's thoughts were interrupted as he walked into the living room, where he found Chris sitting on the couch, her knees drawn together, a look of nervous anticipation on her face. Next to her was a young man with an air of casual arrogance, leaning back with an arm draped along the back of the couch. Mike's heart sank as he took in the scene. "Honey?" Chris began, her voice trembling. Mike froze, staring in disbelief. Her demeanor was a mix of regret, nervousness, and defiance, all too familiar to him after years of marriage. The young man, who Mike now recognized as James, a colleague of Chris's, flashed a not-quite sneer in his direction. Mike slumped into the chair adjacent to the couch, placing himself uncomfortably close to James. His mind raced as he struggled to comprehend the situation. He cracked open a beer, taking a deep sip, trying to calm the storm brewing inside him. "What's going on here, Chris?" he asked, his voice strained with controlled anger. Chris bit her lip, glancing at James before turning back to Mike. "Mike, we need to talk. There's something you need to know." The words hung in the air, heavy with implication. Mike's grip tightened around the beer can, his knuckles turning white. He had mediated countless disputes, yet nothing had prepared him for this personal betrayal. "I'm listening," he said, his voice low and dangerous. Chris took a deep breath, her eyes pleading for understanding. "Mike, I love you. I've always loved you, but I've also fallen for James. I need you to understand that this doesn't change how I feel about you." Mike's world tilted on its axis as her words sank in. The emotional and psychological impact hit him like a freight train. He had devoted himself to their marriage, believing in their bond, their love. And now it was all unraveling before his eyes. The evening sun cast long shadows in the room as Chris continued to explain, her words a blur to Mike. He felt a deep-seated anger and pain bubbling up, threatening to spill over. The confrontation had just begun, and Mike knew there would be no easy resolution. The days leading up to the discovery had been filled with small, seemingly insignificant moments that Mike now realized were signs of something amiss. Chris had started coming home later than usual, her explanations vague and unconvincing. There had been an increase in her business trips, and her demeanor had subtly shifted, small things that Mike, in retrospect, should have paid more attention to. One evening about 2 weeks before the confrontation, Mike had come home to find Chris already asleep, something that rarely happened. She was always waiting up for him, ready to share a nightcap and discuss their day. As he entered their bedroom, he noticed her phone on the bedside table, screen glowing with a notification. A message from JC caught his eye. Mike felt a pang of unease, but brushed it off, attributing it to his own insecurities. "Long day?" Mike had asked the next morning as they sat over breakfast. Chris, avoiding his gaze, nodded. "Yeah, the museum's new exhibit is taking up a lot of my time. Donors are demanding, you know?" Mike had smiled, trying to shake off his doubts. "You're doing great work, Chris. I'm proud of you." The days continued with more of these little oddities. Chris's laughter seemed more forced, her kisses more perfunctory. One night, while watching a movie together, Mike noticed her texting furiously, a faint smile playing on her lips. When he asked who she was talking to, she quickly locked her phone and mumbled something about work. Suspicion gnawed at Mike, but he hesitated to confront her directly. He didn't want to appear paranoid or distrustful, yet the seeds of doubt had been sown. He decided to investigate subtly, looking for patterns in her behavior, anything that might explain the growing distance between them. A few days later, Mike found himself at a bar with his friend Jake, a private investigator. Over drinks, Mike shared his concerns, hoping for some clarity. "Jake, do you think I'm overreacting? Chris has been acting different lately. I can't shake the feeling that something's wrong." Jake leaned back, considering Mike's words. "It's possible she's just stressed, Mike. But if your gut tells you something's off, it's worth looking into. Trust, but verify, right?" Mike nodded, feeling a mix of relief and apprehension. "I don't want to jump to conclusions. I just need to know if there's something I'm missing." Jake offered to look into it discreetly. Mike hesitated but eventually agreed, hoping it would either allay his fears or provide the truth he needed. A week passed with little change. Chris remained distant, and Mike's anxiety grew. One evening, while Chris was out for what she claimed was a work dinner, Jake called. "Mike, I found something. Chris has been meeting someone regularly, and it's not work-related." Mike's heart sank. "Who is it?" "James Carter. Does that name ring a bell?" Mike's mind raced. James. The name was familiar. "Yeah, he's a colleague of Chris's. They've worked on several projects together." "Well, they've been meeting up outside of work hours quite a bit. Thought you should know." Mike thanked Jake and ended the call, feeling a mix of anger and betrayal. He needed to confront Chris but decided to wait until he had more information. He didn't want to accuse her without solid evidence. The next few days were a blur of tension. Mike tried to act normal, but the weight of his suspicions bore down on him. One evening, as Chris prepared for another work dinner, Mike decided to follow her. Keeping a safe distance, he tailed her to a small, intimate restaurant. His heart pounded as he watched her greet James with a hug and a kiss on the cheek. Mike clenched his fists, forcing himself to remain calm. He needed to know more before confronting her. Over the next hour, he watched them laugh and talk, their body language intimate and familiar. It was clear there was more than just a professional relationship between them. Returning home, Mike felt a surge of anger and pain. He knew he had to confront Chris, but he needed to plan his approach carefully. The betrayal was like a knife in his heart, and he wanted to ensure she understood the gravity of her actions. The following morning, Chris was unusually cheerful, which only fueled Mike's anger. He decided to act that evening. As he walked into their condo, he saw the same scene unfold. Chris and James sitting on the couch waiting for him. "Mike," Chris began, her voice shaking, "we need to talk." Mike took a deep breath, ready to face the storm head on. "Yes, we do. And this time, I want the truth." Mike's heart pounded in his chest as he walked into the condo, bracing himself for the confrontation he knew was inevitable. The atmosphere was thick with tension, and he felt a cold sweat trickle down his back. Chris sat on the couch, her face a mask of conflicting emotions, while James lounged next to her with a self-satisfied smirk. "Mike," Chris began, her voice trembling, "we need to talk." Mike took a deep breath, his anger barely contained. "Yes, we do, and this time I want the truth." Chris bit her lip, glancing nervously at James. I don't know where to start." "How about from the beginning?" Mike suggested, his tone icy. "Tell me why I find my wife cozying up to another man in our home." James shifted uncomfortably, his smirk fading. Chris took a deep breath, her eyes pleading for understanding. "Mike, I love you. I've always loved you. But I've also fallen for James. I need you to understand that this doesn't change how I feel about you." Mike's world tilted as her words sank in. He felt a surge of anger, hurt, and betrayal. "So you expect me to just accept this? To share you with him?" He gestured at James, his voice rising. Chris's eyes filled with tears. "Mike, it's not like that. I don't want to hurt you, but my feelings for James are real. I need you to understand." "Understand?" Mike's voice dripped with sarcasm. "You want me to understand that you've been cheating on me? That you've been lying to me?" "It wasn't like that," Chris protested. "It just happened. We didn't plan this." "Didn't plan it?" Mike scoffed. "You don't just fall into someone else's bed by accident, Chris." James decided to speak up. "Mike, I know this is hard, but we didn't mean for it to happen. We just connected." Mike turned his furious gaze to James. "And you thought it was okay to pursue a married woman? To sit here in my home and act like this is normal?" James shifted uncomfortably but held Mike's gaze. "I care about Chris. I'm not trying to replace you, Mike. I just want to be part of her life." "Part of her life?" Mike repeated, incredulous. "And what about me? What about the life we built together? What about our marriage vows?" Chris wiped away a tear, her voice trembling. "Mike, I never stopped loving you. I just found something new with James. It doesn't take away from what we have." Mike shook his head, his anger boiling over. "You don't get it, do you? You've destroyed everything. Our trust, our love, everything." There was a long silence as the weight of Mike's words settled over the room. Chris looked down, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. James shifted again, clearly uncomfortable. Mike took a deep breath, trying to regain control. "So, what's your plan? You expect me to just accept this? To live with you while you're with him?" Chris looked up, her eyes desperate. "I was hoping we could find a way to make it work. I want to be with both of you." Mike stared at her, his disbelief turning to cold, hard resolve. "No, Chris, that's not going to happen." James leaned forward, trying to mediate. "Mike, we can work this out. We can find a way to make everyone happy." Mike snapped, his control finally breaking. "You think this is about happiness? This is about betrayal, about destroying trust. You have no idea what you're talking about." Chris stood up, her face pale and tear-streaked. "Mike, please, we can find a way through this. I love you both." Mike took a step back, his voice deadly calm. "You need to choose, Chris, him or me, because I'm not sharing you." Chris looked between Mike and James, her face torn with indecision. "Mike, I don't want to lose either of you." "You already have," Mike said quietly. "You made your choice when you started this affair." James stood up, placing a hand on Chris's shoulder. "Chris, it's okay. I understand if you need to go back to Mike." Chris looked at James, her eyes filled with confusion and pain. "I don't know what to do." Mike's heart ached as he watched his wife struggle, but he knew what had to be done. "Chris, I love you, but I can't live like this. If you choose him, we're done." Chris took a deep, shuddering breath. "Mike, I can't choose. I need you both." Mike felt a cold, final clarity settle over him. "Then you've made your choice. Pack your things and leave." Chris's eyes widened in shock. "Mike, no, please." "You wanted the truth," Mike said, his voice firm. "The truth is, I can't live with this. I can't live with you betraying me every day." James tried to intervene again. "Mike, don't do this. We can work something out." Mike turned to James, his eyes blazing. "Get out of my house, now!" James hesitated, then nodded. He looked at Chris, who was sobbing uncontrollably. "Chris, let's go." Chris looked at Mike one last time, her eyes filled with sorrow. "I'm sorry, Mike. I never wanted to hurt you." Mike nodded, his face set in stone. "It's too late for apologies. Just go." James gently guided Chris out of the condo, leaving Mike standing alone in the living room. As the door closed behind them, Mike felt a wave of despair wash over him. He had lost everything in the span of a few moments. But amidst the pain, there was a flicker of determination. He wouldn't let this betrayal define him. He would rebuild his life piece by piece, and he would make sure that Chris and James regretted ever underestimating him. The silence in the condo was deafening after Chris and James left. Mike stood motionless, the weight of the confrontation pressing down on him. He felt a surge of emotions, anger, betrayal, sadness, all swirling in a chaotic storm. He needed to clear his mind, to think. Grabbing his coat, he headed out for a walk, hoping the cool night air would help him process what had just happened. As he walked through the quiet streets of Brooklyn, memories of his life with Chris flooded his mind. The laughter, the shared dreams, the intimate moments, they all seemed tainted now. He couldn't understand how everything had fallen apart so quickly. He had always prided himself on his ability to read people, to mediate and resolve conflicts. But this was different. This was personal. Mike found himself at a small park, the playground eerily empty. He sat on a bench, staring at the swings swaying gently in the breeze. His phone buzzed in his pocket, but he ignored it, not ready to face anyone yet. He needed time to think, to figure out his next move. After what felt like hours, he finally headed back home. The condo was as he had left it, a stark reminder of the confrontation. Mike slumped onto the couch, feeling the exhaustion of the day catching up with him. He knew he couldn't avoid dealing with the aftermath forever. He needed a plan. The next morning, Mike woke up to a pounding headache. He glanced at his phone and saw several missed calls and messages from friends and family. News traveled fast, it seemed. He decided to start with the easiest call, his best friend Jake. "Mike, I heard. Are you okay?" Jake's voice was filled with concern. Mike sighed, rubbing his temples. "Not really, Jake. It's a mess. I don't even know where to start. Come over. Let's talk it through. You shouldn't be alone right now." Mike agreed, grateful for the support. He grabbed his keys and headed out, feeling a sliver of relief at the prospect of talking to someone who understood. At Jake's place, the two friends sat in the kitchen, nursing cups of strong coffee. Jake listened intently as Mike recounted the events of the previous night, his anger and hurt evident in every word. "I just don't get it, Jake. How could she do this? We were happy, or at least I thought we were." Jake nodded sympathetically. "Sometimes people do stupid things, Mike. It doesn't make sense, but it happens. The important thing now is figuring out what you want to do next." Mike stared into his coffee cup, lost in thought. "I need to move on, Jake. I can't stay in that condo, surrounded by memories of us. It's too painful." Jake leaned back, considering. "You could stay here for a while. I've got the spare room, and you need some space to clear your head." Mike nodded, feeling a wave of gratitude. "Thanks, Jake. I think I'll take you up on that." Over the next few days, Mike began the painful process of disentangling his life from Chris's. He packed up his belongings, avoiding the mementos that carried too much emotional weight. Each item he put into a box felt like a piece of his heart breaking away, but he knew it was necessary. He called a locksmith to change the locks on the condo, a symbolic gesture to mark the end of an era. It was his way of taking control, of asserting that he would not be a victim. Mike also reached out to a lawyer, beginning the legal process of divorce. The cold, clinical nature of the paperwork contrasted sharply with the emotional turmoil he was experiencing. He found himself going through the motions, numb to the reality of what he was doing. One evening, as he was packing up the last of his things, Chris called. Mike stared at the phone, debating whether to answer. After a moment, he picked up, bracing himself for whatever she had to say. "Mike, I just wanted to check on you." Chris's voice was tentative, filled with regret. Mike took a deep breath, struggling to keep his emotions in check. "What do you want, Chris?" "I know you hate me right now, and I don't blame you, but I still care about you. I wanted to make sure you're okay." "Do you really think I'm okay?" Mike's voice was sharp, cutting through the pretense. "You destroyed our life, Chris. How do you think I feel?" Chris was silent for a moment. "I'm sorry, Mike. I know that doesn't mean much right now, but I am. I never wanted to hurt you." "Well, you did. And now we have to live with the consequences." "I understand if you don't want to talk to me, but if you ever need anything—" Mike cut her off. "I won't. Goodbye, Chris." He hung up, feeling a mix of relief and sorrow. It was the final nail in the coffin of their relationship. There was no going back now. As the days turned into weeks, Mike began to rebuild his life. He threw himself into his work, finding solace in the routine and the satisfaction of helping others resolve their conflicts. He reconnected with old friends, started going to the gym, and even picked up his old hobby of writing. But the nights were the hardest. Alone in Jake's spare room, Mike would often lie awake, replaying the events in his mind. The what-ifs and could-have-beens haunted him, but he knew he couldn't let them define him. He had to move forward, to find a new path. One evening, Mike received a call from his sister, Emily. She had always been his rock, the one he could turn to in times of trouble. "Hey, Mike, how are you holding up?" Mike sighed. "I'm managing, Em. It's tough, but I'm getting through it. I've been thinking about you a lot. Why don't you come down to Boston for a while? Spend some time with the family? It might do you some good." Mike considered it. A change of scenery might be exactly what he needed. "You know what, Em? That sounds like a good idea. I'll book a flight." A few days later, Mike found himself in Boston, surrounded by the familiar comfort of his childhood home. His mother and siblings welcomed him with open arms, providing a much-needed distraction from his troubles. As he spent time with his family, Mike felt the healing process begin. He realized that despite everything, he still had people who loved and supported him. It was a small but significant step towards rebuilding his life. One evening, as he sat on the porch with Emily, she turned to him, her eyes filled with concern. "Mike, you know you're going to get through this, right? You're stronger than you think." Mike smiled, feeling a glimmer of hope. "Thanks, Em. I needed to hear that." They sat in comfortable silence, the bond between them providing a sense of solace. Mike knew he had a long road ahead, but he also knew he wasn't alone. He had his family, his friends, and the strength within him to overcome the betrayal and rebuild his life. Returning from Boston, Mike felt a renewed sense of purpose. He had decided to face his situation head-on, using his skills as a mediator to navigate the turmoil. But he also knew he needed to confront Chris and James one last time to truly move on. Mike decided to call a meeting with Chris and James at a neutral location, a small cafe they used to frequent. The choice of place was deliberate, a setting filled with memories that would remind Chris of what they once had. He hoped it would provide the gravity needed for this final showdown. Chris and James arrived together, their demeanor hesitant and filled with unease. Mike was already seated, a cup of coffee in front of him, his face calm but determined. "Thank you both for coming," Mike began, his voice steady. "We need to talk. There are things that need to be said." Chris looked nervous, her eyes darting between Mike and James. James, on the other hand, seemed more composed, ready for whatever Mike had planned. "Mike," Chris started, her voice soft, "I know this is hard for you. It's hard for all of us." Mike held up a hand to stop her. Let's not pretend we all share the same burden, Chris. You made your choices, and now we deal with the consequences. James leaned forward, trying to diffuse the tension. Mike, we didn't want things to end up like this. We care about you. Mike's eyes flashed with anger. Care about me? You cared so much that you destroyed my marriage, my trust. Don't talk to me about care. Chris's eyes filled with tears. Mike, we never meant to hurt you. We just what? Mike interrupted, his voice rising. You just fell into each other's arms? You just thought I wouldn't notice? Or care? There was a tense silence, the weight of Mike's words hanging in the air. Chris wiped away a tear, struggling to find her voice. Mike, she said finally, I know I've hurt you, and I know I can't undo that, but I need you to understand that my feelings for James don't diminish what I feel for you. Mike shook his head, a bitter laugh escaping his lips. You keep saying that, Chris, but every time you chose him, you diminished us. You can't have it both ways. James tried to intervene again. Mike, we can find a way to make this work. There's no reason we can't all be happy. Mike's expression hardened. No, James. The reason is that you two have betrayed me in the worst possible way. There is no making this work. Chris reached out, her hand trembling. Mike, please. I love you. I always will. Can't we find a way to get past this? Mike looked at her, his heart aching. Chris, love isn't enough. Trust is the foundation of any relationship, and you shattered that. There's no going back. James sighed, rubbing his temples. Mike, what do you want us to do? How can we fix this? Mike's gaze turned icy. You can start by leaving my life, completely. I need space to heal, and I can't do that with you two hanging around. Chris's eyes widened in shock. Mike, no. Please don't do this. I have to, Chris. For my own sanity. You made your choice, and now I'm making mine. James looked defeated, his shoulders slumping. If that's what you need, Mike, we'll respect it. Mike nodded, feeling a sense of finality. Thank you. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have a life to rebuild. He stood up, leaving Chris and James sitting in stunned silence. As he walked out of the cafe, he felt a mix of relief and sorrow. It was over. The confrontation had provided the closure he needed, but it also marked the end of a significant chapter in his life. Over the next few weeks, Mike focused on moving forward. He poured himself into his work, finding solace in helping others resolve their conflicts. He also started attending a support group for people going through similar experiences. Sharing his story and hearing others helped him feel less alone. One evening, after a particularly grueling day at work, Mike received a call from an unfamiliar number. Hesitant, he answered. Mike? It's James. Mike's grip tightened on the phone. What do you want, James? I know you don't want to hear from me, but I need to tell you something. Mike's patience was thin. Make it quick. James took a deep breath. Chris and I ended things. I realized that what we had was based on lies and betrayal. It couldn't last. Mike was silent for a moment, processing the news. Why are you telling me this? Because I want you to know that I'm sorry, truly. I never meant to come between you two. I thought I loved Chris, but I realize now that I was wrong. Mike felt a strange mix of emotions. Thank you for telling me, but it doesn't change what happened. I know. I just thought you should know. Mike ended the call, feeling a sense of closure. He didn't need or want James's apology, but hearing it gave him a sense of finality. He could move on, knowing that chapter was truly closed. As the months passed, Mike continued to rebuild his life. He found joy in small things, rekindling old hobbies, spending time with friends, and focusing on his personal growth. He even started dating again, taking things slow and allowing himself to heal. One evening, Mike sat at his favorite park, watching the sunset. He reflected on his journey, the pain and the growth. He had come a long way from the man who had been blindsided by betrayal. He was stronger now, more resilient. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Mike smiled to himself. He knew there would be challenges ahead, but he was ready to face them. He had survived the storm and emerged stronger. And for the first time in a long time, he felt hopeful about the future. The months following the climactic showdown were a whirlwind of change for Mike. He had severed ties with Chris and James, but the journey to rebuild his life was just beginning. He focused on reclaiming his identity, one step at a time. One of the first things Mike did was move out of Jake's spare room and into a new apartment in Manhattan. It was a modest place, but it represented a fresh start. The act of decorating it, choosing furniture and artwork, was therapeutic. Each choice was a step towards creating a space that was entirely his own. Mike also threw himself into his work. Mediation had always been his passion, and now it became his sanctuary. Helping others navigate their conflicts gave him a sense of purpose and reminded him of his own strength. His colleagues noticed the change in him, admiring his resilience and dedication. Outside of work, Mike rekindled old friendships and made new ones. He joined a hiking club, rediscovering his love for the outdoors. The physical exertion and the beauty of nature were a balm for his soul. He also reconnected with his creative side, taking a writing workshop and finding joy in crafting stories again. Despite the progress, there were still difficult days. Nights when the loneliness felt overwhelming, or when memories of Chris would resurface, bringing with them a wave of sadness. On those nights, Mike would call his sister Emily, who always knew how to lift his spirits. "Mike, you're doing great," Emily would say, her voice warm and reassuring. "Healing takes time. Be patient with yourself." One evening, as Mike was settling in with a glass of wine and a good book, his phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. He hesitated, then opened it. "Hi, Mike. It's Chris. I know you probably don't want to hear from me, but I wanted to let you know I'm moving out of the city. I've taken a job in San Francisco. I thought you should know. I'm sorry for everything. I hope you find happiness. Chris." Mike stared at the message, a mix of emotions swirling within him. He felt a pang of sadness, but also a sense of relief. Chris moving away meant that chapter of his life was truly closing. He took a deep breath and typed a simple reply. "Thank you for letting me know. I wish you the best. Mike." With that, he deleted the message thread and blocked her number, feeling a weight lift from his shoulders. It was time to fully embrace his new life. A few weeks later, Mike was at a coffee shop, enjoying a rare moment of leisure. He was reading through a manuscript he had been working on when a woman approached him. "Excuse me, are you Mike Anderson?" Mike looked up, surprised. The woman was about his age, with kind eyes and a warm smile. "Yes, I am. Do we know each other?" She laughed lightly. "Not really. I've seen you around at the hiking club." "I'm Sarah." Mike smiled, feeling a spark of connection. "Nice to meet you, Sarah. Care to join me?" She sat down, and they struck up a conversation that flowed effortlessly. They talked about hiking, books, and their favorite places in the city. There was an ease between them that Mike hadn't felt in a long time. As the evening progressed, Mike realized how much he enjoyed Sarah's company. She was intelligent, funny, and shared many of his interests. When they finally parted ways, they exchanged numbers, both eager to see each other again. Over the next few months, Mike and Sarah grew closer. They went on hikes, explored the city, and discovered new restaurants together. Sarah was understanding and patient, never pushing Mike to talk about his past until he was ready. And when he did, she listened without judgment. One evening, as they sat on a bench overlooking the Hudson River, Mike felt a sense of peace he hadn't known in a long time. He turned to Sarah, his heart full. "Sarah, I want to thank you. You've been a bright spot in my life. I didn't think I could feel this way again." Sarah smiled, her eyes shining. "Mike, you deserve happiness. We both do, and I'm glad we found each other." They shared a tender kiss, the city lights twinkling around them. For the first time since his world had been shattered, Mike felt whole again. Life continued to move forward. Mike and Sarah's relationship blossomed, built on trust, mutual respect, and a deep emotional connection. They supported each other through their individual challenges, growing stronger together. Mike also found closure with his mediation work. He began giving talks on conflict resolution and emotional resilience, sharing his own experiences to help others. His story resonated with many, and he found fulfillment in guiding others through their darkest times. One day, while organizing his new apartment, Mike came across an old photo album. He flipped through it, seeing images of his life with Chris, happy moments, vacations, celebrations. He felt a pang of nostalgia, but also a sense of gratitude. Those experiences had shaped him, taught him valuable lessons, and brought him to where he was now. He carefully closed the album and placed it back on the shelf. The past was a part of him, but it no longer defined him. He had moved on, grown stronger, and found new love and purpose. As he looked around his apartment, filled with the warmth and love he and Sarah had created, Mike smiled. He had rebuilt his life from the ashes, stronger and more resilient than ever. The journey had been painful, but it had also been transformative. Mike knew there would still be challenges ahead, but he was ready to face them. He had the support of loved ones, a fulfilling career, and a partner who truly understood and cherished him. For the first time in a long time, he felt hopeful and excited about the future. He raised his glass in a silent toast to the new beginnings and the unexpected twists that life had brought him. The sun set on another day, casting a golden glow over the city, and Mike embraced the promise of tomorrow with open arms.